Okay, let's dive into a topic that's, well, incredibly important for everyone: understanding heart attacks.
Absolutely vital stuff.
We've got a document right here that lays out the causes, the risk factors, and what can be done.
A good source to work from.
So our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack this specific source. We want to pull out the most important insights, the real nuggets of knowledge, and give you a clear picture of what this document actually says a heart attack is, why it happens, and crucially, how to think about prevention based on this text.
Getting straight to the core info from the source. Good plan.
So, right from the get-go, the document gives us a core definition. A heart attack, or myocardial infarction, is what happens when blood flow to a part of the heart muscle gets blocked.
Right, blocked flow.
And usually the source says that blockage is caused by a blood clot. When that blood can't get through, that piece of the heart muscle, well, it loses oxygen and starts to die.
That lack of oxygen is the critical damage trigger.
Exactly. But what the text really emphasizes, though, is that while the event, the heart attack itself, can feel sudden.
Yeah, like it comes out of nowhere sometimes.
Right. But the process leading up to it usually develops over time. It's influenced by a mix of things: lifestyle, genetics, existing health conditions, like the document says.
So it's rarely just poof, you know. There's usually an underlying story building up.
Precisely. It's not materializing from thin air. So, okay, if a blood clot is the most common culprit, what does this document say is the primary reason those clots form or block the flow in the first place?
Well, the text points pretty clearly to atherosclerosis as the leading underlying cause.
Atherosclerosis. That's the hardening and narrowing of the arteries, right?
Exactly. The document describes it as plaque building up inside the artery walls. And this plaque, it says, is made of things like fat, cholesterol, other substances.
Sort of like gunk in a pipe.
Kind of, yeah. And over time, it hardens and narrows that passage, restricting blood flow. But the critical point the source makes is when that plaque ruptures.
Ruptures, like it breaks open.
Yeah, if it breaks open, that can trigger a blood clot to form right there on the spot. And that clot is what can then completely block the artery,
causing the heart attack.
That's the sequence the document lays out for the most common scenario.
So it's often this long-term issue, the plaque building up, that leads to a very sudden acute event, the clot blocking everything.
That's the main pathway described.
But the document also notes it's not always atherosclerosis causing the blockage, is it?
That's right. The text specifically mentions a few other mechanisms, which is important context. One is coronary artery spasm.
A spasm, like a muscle cramp, but in the heart's artery.
Essentially, yeah. It's a temporary sudden tightening of the muscle in the artery wall. The source says it can shut off blood flow, even if there isn't a lot of plaque buildup.
Wow. And what triggers that, according to the text?
The source gives examples like certain drug use. It specifically mentions cocaine, but also things like intense emotional stress or even smoking.
Okay, so you can have relatively clear arteries, theoretically, but still have a heart attack if an artery just clamps down hard.
Precisely. The text shows it's a different pathway. Then it also lists blood clots or embolisms that actually form somewhere else in the body.
Like in the legs.
Yeah, maybe in the legs, and then they travel through the bloodstream and get stuck in one of the heart's arteries.
Like a traveling roadblock.
A traveling roadblock, exactly. And the final one the document includes, which it notes is rare, is spontaneous coronary artery dissection, SCAD.
SCAD. That sounds pretty dramatic.
It is. The source describes it as a tear, a non-traumatic tear happening inside the wall of a coronary artery.
Not caused by injury.
Right. And what's particularly striking, and the text notes this, is that it often affects younger people, especially women, who might seem perfectly healthy otherwise. Sometimes around pregnancy, it mentions.
That's really different from the typical image.
It really is. And I think understanding these different causes, even the less common ones like spasm or SCAD, it gives us a much fuller picture based on the source. It shows that while atherosclerosis is the big one, other things can cause a heart attack.
That's a great point. It's definitely not just one single simple mechanism. Okay, so the document lays out these potential causes, and then it shifts gears to talk about the factors that increase your risk of one of these things happening.
Yeah, the risk factors.
And it helpfully splits them into two main buckets. Things you, can't really change, and things you potentially can.
the non-modifiable and the modifiable.
Let's look at the ones you can't modify first. The non-modifiable risk factors. The text lists age as a big one.
Yes, definitely. The risk just generally goes up as you get older. The document specifies men over 45 and women over 55 being in a higher risk category.
And gender itself is listed as a factor in the text.
The document mentions men generally tend to have a higher risk earlier in life compared to women.
But then women catch up.
Yeah, a woman's risk tends to increase significantly after menopause, the source says, eventually sort of evening out with men's risk later on.
Family history is in there too, right? If heart disease runs in your family.
Absolutely. The source is clear. Having a family history, especially if a close relative, like a parent or sibling, had a heart attack young, that significantly increases your risk.
And that ties into genetics too, which the document mentions separately.
Right. Inherited genes can predispose people to things that raise risk, like naturally high cholesterol or high blood pressure right from the start.
So if you look at this list and you know you've got some of these non-modifiable risks, maybe you're over 55 or your dad had an early heart attack, does the document suggest you're just stuck with a higher risk profile? What's the takeaway?
Well, this raises a really important point that the source kind of implies. You obviously can't change your age or your genes.
Right.
But knowing you have these factors is still vital. Why? Because it tells you you might have an inherent susceptibility, a higher baseline risk, maybe. Which means, the implication is, you might need to pay even closer attention to the factors that you can control.
So it's like an early warning signal to be extra vigilant about the other stuff.
Exactly. It's about understanding your personal baseline risk from the source's perspective and being potentially more proactive in the areas where you do have some agency.
Agency. That brings us perfectly to the modifiable risk factors, the ones this document says you can influence or manage. This list is really crucial, isn't it?
It really is. This is where the source highlights the potential for prevention.
Okay, first up, the document lists high blood pressure, or hypertension.
Yeah, and the text explains why. Consistently high pressure basically damages your artery walls over time, makes them tougher, less flexible, and more vulnerable to that plaque buildup and narrowing we talked about.
So it's not just a number, it's actively hurting the vessels.
That's the picture the source paints.
And high cholesterol, that's a classic one.
Right. The source specifically calls out high levels of LDL, the bad cholesterol, as directly contributing to plaque. And it also mentions that low levels of HDL, the good cholesterol, don't help either. They contribute to the risk.
Got it. Smoking is definitely on this list.
Oh, absolutely. The document is very clear. Smoking is hugely damaging. It says it harms the lining of the arteries, speeds up atherosclerosis.
And reduces oxygen in the blood.
Reduces oxygen your blood can carry, yeah. All things that spike heart attack risk. The text even makes a point of mentioning the dramatic drop in risk you can see within just a year of quitting.
Wow, that's encouraging.
It really highlights the impact of tackling that one factor.
Diabetes is another major player here, according to the source.
Yes. It explains that having high blood sugar over time damages blood vessels all over the body, and that includes the ones supplying the heart. Plus, the document notes it can harm the nerves that help control your heart.
Okay. And the document links obesity and being overweight to increased risk too. How does it explain that connection?
It basically says that carrying excess weight puts more strain directly on the heart itself, makes it work harder. And importantly, it significantly increases your chances of developing other risk factors, like diabetes and high blood pressure.
So it's a double whammy, kind of?
It seems that way from the text, yeah, which ties right into the next one. Physical inactivity.
Makes sense, if you're not active.
Exactly. The source says lack of regular exercise contributes to obesity, but also directly worsens blood pressure, cholesterol levels, and blood sugar control. The document really paints a clear picture of how interconnected all these lifestyle factors are.
And of course, diet is central. What kind of diet does the source flag as risky?
It points to unhealthy diets, particularly those high in saturated and trans fats, too much salt, and lots of added sugars. It says these directly contribute to problems like high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and overall heart risk.
It's the fuel you're putting in the system.
That's a good way to put it.
Excessive alcohol use is mentioned as well.
Yes. The document notes that consistently drinking too much can raise blood pressure. And in severe cases, it says it can contribute to heart muscle damage, potentially leading to heart failure.
Okay. Stress is listed too. That's interesting. How does the source say stress impacts risk?
The text links chronic stress, long-term stress to potential damage to arteries. It also notes that stress can worsen other risk factors.
How so?
Well, like making it harder to control blood pressure, maybe? Or leading to unhealthy coping mechanisms like stress eating or smoking more.
Right, the knock-on effects.
Exactly. And one more the source includes here, which might surprise some people: sleep disorders.
Like sleep apnea.
Sleep apnea is the main example given, yeah. The document indicates there's a link between conditions like that and an increased risk of high blood pressure, stroke, and heart attacks.
Huh. So it's not just diet and exercise. Sleep and stress are in the mix too, according to this source.
It's interesting how the source broadens that definition of lifestyle factors, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And it's fascinating how interconnected this whole list feels. You manage one, like diet, and it probably helps with weight, cholesterol, maybe even blood pressure.
It truly does show that ripple effect. The document presents heart health less as just avoiding specific bad things and more like actively building a healthy, resilient system overall. And these modifiable factors are where the source says you have the most direct power.
That's empowering. Now, the document also includes a section on some emerging and maybe indirect risk factors, broadens the scope even more.
Right. It talks about the role of inflammation.
Inflammation, like when you get a cut.
Well, yes, but here it's talking about chronic, low-level inflammation inside the body. The source suggests this inflammation plays a role in the development of atherosclerosis, that plaque buildup.
So inflammation isn't just a symptom, it could be part of the cause.
That's what the document suggests is an emerging understanding. It mentions elevated levels of something called C-reactive protein, or CRP, as a possible marker in the blood that might signal this underlying inflammation and increased risk.
Interesting. And it connects this to autoimmune diseases too.
Yes, like lupus or rheumatoid arthritis. The text notes these conditions increase cardiovascular risk, and it attributes that, at least in part, to the chronic inflammation that comes with them.
Okay. Air pollution is on this list too. That feels different, more environmental.
It is. The document points to studies linking long-term exposure to air pollution with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So it's bringing in an environmental health factor.
And it even mentions socioeconomic status. How does that fit in according to the source?
The text notes a correlation. Things like lower income or limited access to healthcare tend to go along with higher rates of heart disease.
Why, does it say?
It suggests potential reasons like maybe inadequate preventive care, less access to healthy food options, maybe higher stress levels associated with socioeconomic challenges. The source is basically showing the picture is bigger than just individual choices sometimes. There are systemic and environmental factors at play too.
It definitely adds layers of complexity beyond just, eat your vegetables.
Sure.
The document then specifically highlights heart attack in special populations, noting that symptoms or risk can differ. This seems really important.
Well, this section is critical for awareness. For women, the document really stresses that symptoms can often be less typical than that classic crushing chest pain image we all have.
What kind of symptoms does it list for women?
Things like nausea, unexplained or unusual fatigue, maybe shortness of breath, and pain in the back, neck, or jaw. It emphasizes these can be subtler.
Which could lead to delays in getting help, I guess.
Exactly. Recognizing these atypical signs, the source implies, is vital because delayed diagnosis and treatment can have serious consequences. That's a really important nugget of info from the text.
Absolutely. The text also notes an increase in heart attacks among young adults.
It does. It links this worrying trend back to some of those modifiable risk factors we discussed: rising rates of obesity, maybe type 2 diabetes, unhealthy lifestyles, stress, and substance use in younger groups.
So it's not just an older person's problem anymore.
Not according to this source, no. And it also highlights diabetics, people with diabetes.
Why specifically?
Because they might experience silent heart attacks. The document explains that nerve damage from diabetes, called neuropathy, can sometimes dull or even completely mask the typical chest pain signal.
So a heart attack could happen with very mild symptoms, or maybe none they recognize.
That's the danger highlighted in the text. Knowing this is key if you or someone you know has diabetes. The source's emphasis here on these population-specific differences really underscores how important it is to be tuned into your own body and your individual risk profile.
That awareness of varied symptoms is so crucial, especially since the document then pivots to stress that recognizing the signs and symptoms early is vital for detection in anyone.
Right, and the text lists the key symptoms to watch for, emphasizing again these are signals, not causes themselves.
Okay, so what's on that list from the source?
Chest pain or discomfort is the main one, often described as pressure, squeezing, fullness, or just pain, typically in the center or left side.
But not always pain.
Not always sharp pain, no. Could be pressure. Then, shortness of breath, which the source says might happen before, during, or even after any chest discomfort.
Okay.
Pain or discomfort spreading, radiating to other areas. Commonly the arms, often the left, but could be either or both. Also the back, neck, or jaw.
So pain moving around.
Yeah. And it adds other possible signs too, like nausea or vomiting. Breaking out in a cold sweat for no apparent reason, and feeling lightheaded or dizzy.
That's quite a list.
It is. And the document is very clear. Experiencing one or more of these, especially if they come on suddenly or feel severe or unusual for you, warrants immediate medical attention. 9/11, don't wait.
Because early recognition saves life.
That's the explicit message from the source. It can absolutely be life-saving.
Okay, so we've covered the what it is, the why it happens according to the source, and the how to spot it. Then the document moves into, well, the good news section, prevention.
Yes, this is where the source really brings it all together. It maps out the actionable steps, the things you can do that directly address those modifiable risk factors we talked about earlier.
It's the roadmap, like you said.
Exactly. It's the practical advice derived from understanding the risks.
So the text starts with healthy diet. What does it recommend?
It recommends focusing on things like whole grains, lots of vegetables and fruits, lean protein sources. And on the flip side, actively avoiding processed foods, things high in added sugars, saturated fats, and trans fats. Basically, nourishing this system properly.
Makes sense. Exercise regularly is next. Is there a specific target?
Yes. The guideline mentioned in the source is aiming for at least 150 minutes of moderate aerobic activity each week.
Like brisk walking.
Brisk walking, cycling, swimming, yeah. Something that gets your heart rate up moderately. It's a specific, achievable goal laid out right there in the text.
Quit smoking gets its own clear point, doesn't it?
It does. Because, as the document stated earlier when discussing risks, quitting has such a dramatic positive impact, and relatively quickly too. The force presents it as one of the most impactful single actions you can take.
And managing existing conditions is key.
Absolutely. Things like high blood pressure and diabetes. The source emphasizes the importance of regular checkups and diligently taking any prescribed medications to keep those conditions well controlled. It's about medical management being part of the prevention plan.
Cholesterol management is listed too.
Right. This means, according to the source, monitoring your levels, LDL, HDL, triglycerides, and taking steps to keep them healthy. That often involves a mix of diet, exercise, and sometimes medication, all aimed at combating that plaque buildup.
Stress reduction is included in the prevention strategies as well.
Yes, the document suggests practices like mindfulness, meditation, or maybe yoga as ways to manage chronic stress, acknowledging that link we discussed earlier between stress and potentially worsening other risk factors.
And finally, weight management.
The source recommends maintaining a healthy body mass index, or BMI. It even gives the range, 18.5 to 24.9. This ties back to reducing the overall burden on the heart and lowering the risk of related conditions like diabetes and hypertension.
It's really powerful seeing this list laid out so clearly in the document. It feels like it directly answers the "what can I do?" question based on the risks identified earlier.
It really shows that agency the document highlights. These aren't just vague ideas. The source presents them as direct countermeasures to the specific modifiable risks.
Now, the document does briefly touch on medical interventions, right? For people who are already at high risk or maybe who've already had a heart attack.
Yes, it mentions those too. It lists some common medications. Things like statins, which are primarily for lowering cholesterol.
Okay.
Aspirin, which can help prevent blood clots.
Yeah.
But the source implies this should be as prescribed by a doctor, not just taken randomly. And then medications like beta blockers and ACE inhibitors, often used to manage blood pressure and reduce the heart's workload after an event or in high-risk situations.
And surgical options are mentioned too.
Yes, procedures like angioplasty and stenting, where they use a balloon and a tiny mesh tube, a stent, to open up a blocked artery, and coronary artery bypass surgery, often called CABG or bypass surgery, which is usually for more complex or multiple blockages.
So medical tools are available.
Definitely. The source acknowledges these are vital tools in the medical arsenal for treatment and secondary prevention. However, it's fair to say the document's overall message, especially looking at its conclusion, really puts a strong emphasis on the foundational power of primary prevention, managing those lifestyle and medical risks before an event happens.
That seems like a key takeaway, So, wrapping up this deep dive into the source document on heart attacks, we've covered the primary causes it lists, from the very common atherosclerosis to rarer things like SCAD. We looked at the major risk factors, separating the non-modifiable from the very actionable modifiable ones.
Right, the things you can influence.
We touched on those emerging risks like inflammation and environmental factors, listed the crucial symptoms the document says to watch for, including those atypical ones.
Which is so important for awareness.
And we detailed the prevention strategies it outlines, from diet and exercise to managing stress and existing conditions. It seems really clear from this material that while heart attacks are obviously a serious threat, the source makes a powerful case that they are, to a significant extent, preventable.
I think that's the core message that resonates from the document, yeah. By understanding what causes heart attacks and what increases your risk based on this source, you are genuinely empowered to take proactive steps for your own heart health.
Knowledge is power in this case.
Exactly.
Right.
The source frames prevention not just as, dodging a bullet, but as actively building a foundation for long-term wellness.
Well, we truly hope this deep dive has given you valuable, distilled insights pulled straight from the source material you shared with us.
And maybe here's a final thought for you to consider. Something that strikes me from the document's contrast between how risk builds up versus how the event occurs. If the process leading to a heart attack often unfolds slowly, over years or even decades, kind of subtly increasing vulnerability.
Right, the gradual plaque buildup.
Yet the heart attack event itself can strike suddenly, be incredibly abrupt, and potentially devastating. Well, doesn't that raise an important question about the urgency of taking those preventative steps, even the small ones, starting today, rather than putting it off?